You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 357 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. With the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, the 13 colonies found themselves at war with Great Britain. British military forces ranked among the most powerful in the world. By contrast, the colonies had militiamen, civilian volunteers, because the Continental Congress had not yet established its Continental Army and Navy. Which raises the question, how did the Continental Congress approach creating military forces that could go toe-to-toe with the British military? That's a really big question. And today, we're joined by author and historian Eric J. Dolan to answer part of this question by looking at the creation of the new United States' privateer fleet. Eric is the author of many books about the maritime history of early America in the Atlantic world, and his latest book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution, will lend itself well to our conversation. Now, as we explore the world of privateering in the American Revolution, Eric reveals what privateering was and how it differed from piracy, why the American revolutionaries turned so quickly to privateering as a military option during the American Revolution, and how privateers helped the United States win its independence. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a listener-led and listener-driven book club? Poor Richard's Book Club was created and is hosted by listeners just like yourself. Each meeting brings a new chapter and discussion of books we've discussed on this podcast or will discuss on this podcast. Plus, the club's organizers, Shari and Heather, always bring in guests and readers like yourself to lead each conversation. For more information about how you can join the Poor Richard's Book Club and meet up with fellow listeners, visit benfranklinsworld.com/book club. That's benfranklinsworld.com/book club. All right, are you ready to take to the high seas and explore the early American world of privateers and privateering? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is the author of 15 books on American and maritime history. These books include Black Flags, Blue Waters, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates, and A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes. Today, he joins us to speak about his latest book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Eric J. Dolan.
Thanks for having me.
So, Eric, you've written a lot of books and very extensively about the history of early America, and specifically about its history on the Atlantic Ocean. Although I do think there was that one book that took us out into the Pacific, but that still leaves 14 books about the maritime history of the Atlantic Ocean. So I wonder if you could tell us how you became interested and involved with Atlantic maritime history.
It's a long and sordid history, but I'll make it quick. Basically, when I was young, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Jacques Cousteau was my hero. I was seriously into malacology, which is the study of seashells. I went undergraduate, master's, and PhD, all in environmental policy and public policy. But all during this time, I was always writing on the side. I wasn't particularly that keen on history at that time. It was more science that I was interested in. By the time I got my PhD, my whole focus had shifted. I lost all interest in being a professor. Here I had a PhD, all these degrees, and I needed to get a job. So I started working in environmental policy, and I had many jobs in environmental policy. And again, at each one of those jobs, I liked writing the most. That was what most interested me. So I finally, in the late 1990s, told my wife that I wanted to be a writer. She basically told me that I had to put aside a year's worth of my salary before I could think about quitting and becoming a writer. And it took me quite a few years. I was always writing in the morning or on weekends. And finally, in 2007, I became a full-time writer. But the way that maritime stuff comes into that is the early books I wrote were on history or wildlife and often involved the ocean because I naturally was drawn towards maritime topics because of my science background. And then once I started writing history books, and especially after moving to Marblehead, Massachusetts, where I'm speaking to you from, which is right on the ocean, the maritime hook seemed very natural to me. I was comfortable with it, even though I'm not a sailor, but I love the ocean. I love animals in the ocean, and I love tales about the sea. And that's where I've tended to stay. Now, I hope one day to go back to topics that aren't necessarily maritime. I love maritime, but the fact that I love the ocean and I know a lot about the animals in the ocean sort of pulls me towards maritime topics generally.
I wonder if you'd gone back to grad school today, if you would have studied environmental history, because it sounds like you would have fit very naturally within that historical specialty.
Yeah, I think so. I did take 2 classes on, it wasn't really environmental history, but it had a lot of environmental components by a very famous professor, William Cronin, who wrote Changes in the Land. I took 2 classes on the American West with him, and I think that helped spur my interest in writing interesting history, because he clearly did. But yeah, I've often thought, what would happen if I went back and do it all over? And if I could go back and do it all over again, I'd probably study slightly different things. I think I would have started writing earlier because of all the jobs I've ever had, writing is what I enjoy the most. But then again, it's because of my life experiences that I ended up where I am today. So you can't go back, but you can think about it. And yes, environmental history is a great area. There wasn't a lot of it when I was in school, but there are a lot of great books that have been written on environmental history, popular narrative books as well.
So you enjoy stories about the sea and sea animals, and yet you wrote this book about privateering called Rebels at Sea. Eric, what brought you to this topic? How did you become interested in privateers and privateering?
I wrote a book called Black Flags, Blue Waters, which is about piracy in the late 1600s and the early 1700s. And in that book, I talk a lot about privateering, but back then, these quote unquote privateers were actually pirates. During King William's War, the American colonies issued letters of marque or privateering licenses, and those privateers were supposed to go out and fight the French, which is the ones with whom England was at war at the time. But a lot of these quote-unquote privateers, instead of going out and fighting the French, they went around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, and they attacked Mughal ships transiting between the Indian subcontinent and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha, and they basically stole stuff from them. Money, jewels, cloth, and they brought it back to the colonies, which were starved of goods and currency by the mother country. So these pirates were welcomed back. And in fact, colonial governments would get kickbacks from the privateers, pirates, as they came back into the colonies, and they would get paid for issuing these bogus letters of marque. So in writing Black Flags, Blue Waters, I was exposed to this issue of privateering the way that many people think about it, that privateering is just licensed piracy and there's no difference. However, after I finished the book, every time I gave a talk, people would always ask me about privateers and aren't privateers pirates. And I've always loved the American Revolution, so I was reading a little bit about it, and then I read an article that talked a little bit about privateering. And I said, oh, this seems a little different than the privateering I talked about in Black Flags, Blue Waters, because these privateers actually adhered to the privateering code, quote unquote, and they weren't pirates. I don't believe they were legalized pirates. So I said, this is an interesting topic. It hasn't been written about extensively. I didn't believe, and I still don't, that before my book, that there was a good, complete narrative history of privateering in the American Revolution. So that's how I came up with the idea. I said, hey, it sort of bookends with Black Flags, Blue Waters, since so many people who are into pirates conflate them with privateers. And this is a good opportunity to at least make one finer distinction between privateering in the American Revolution, which I don't view as piracy, and privateering in earlier decades and centuries, which often was indistinguishable from piracy.
You mentioned that in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, there wasn't really a distinction between privateering and piracy. That privateering really just was a form of piracy. But you note that by the 1770s, by the time of the American Revolution, there was a distinction between piracy and privateering. And Kristen would like to know what early Americans meant by privateer and privateering by the 1770s, and how privateering would have been different than piracy at that point?
Well, piracy is essentially thieves on the ocean. They are operating on behalf of themselves. Some people have called them Robin Hood's men, that they're stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Well, if that's true, the only rich they're stealing from is anybody they could find in the open ocean. And the poor that they're giving the booty to are themselves. They weren't fighting for larger political causes. And pirates were essentially rogues on the ocean. Now, privateers had the same exact skill set as pirates, and that creates part of the problem. If you're going out to attack a merchant ship, there are pretty much only one way to do it. But privateering, when it's practiced as it's supposed to be by countries that are at war, they use privateering as a way to create a free navy, in a sense, or a militia of the sea. It uses the profit motive combined with the patriotism motive to tap into merchant ships that are already available and men that are willing to go on those ships and fight for their country to capture enemy shipping during times of war and bring those ships and their cargoes back into ports where they can be adjudicated and it can be determined whether or not it's a legitimate prize. And then the ship and its cargo can be sold, and 50% the profits will go to the owners and the investors, and the other 50% will go to the men on board. So superficially, there are some parallels between privateering and piracy. They're attacking ships at sea. They are generating wealth for themselves to some extent. But the framework within which they're doing this is very different. There are rules and quote unquote regulations that apply to privateering during the American Revolution. There are no rules and regulations other than the Pirates Code, which applies to piracy. And there are some similarities, interestingly enough, between pirate articles of agreement and privateering articles of agreement, one of which is privateers had a form of workman's compensation just like pirates did. If you got injured while you were in the act of privateering, you could get some money for losing an arm, an eye, and the same with pirates. So it is a fine line, but I think it is a line nonetheless between privateering when it's practiced properly and piracy. And keep in mind, I am not condoning privateering. I'm reflecting the history that was. And for many centuries, privateering was a well-accepted legal norm almost that was used by European countries when they were at war with other countries as a means of expanding their power on the seas. And the minute that the war was over, letters of marque are rescinded and privateers have to stop being privateers. And interestingly enough, during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 1700s, there were a number of real privateers that went forth from England and the colonies to fight in that war. And the minute that the war was over in 1713, those letters of marque were rescinded. Many of the privateers went back into their former lives or maybe worked for the Navy or did whatever. But a number of ex-privateersmen decided that, okay, the economic outlook in England is not that good. There's an economic recession going on right now. I've got all these skills. I know how to attack ships. Why don't I do it for myself? And a lot of privateers after the War of the Spanish Succession turning to piracy is what helped fuel the quote unquote Pirates of the Caribbean phase of piracy in the 17 teens and 1720s. So because privateering historically has such a dark name associated with it, and so many privateers, like Sir Francis Drake, for example, were actually pirates in everything but name, it gave privateering a bad reputation. And that extended throughout the 1700s and certainly into the American Revolution and even beyond, because America relied on privateers once again during the War of 1812. And there are other iterations of privateering beyond the American Revolution. So that's a very long answer to a short question, but I think there is a distinction.
Given that the practice of privateering goes back centuries, when did the practice of privateering and of hiring privateers make its way to British North America? Where does British North America even fit within this history of privateering?
The first time that privateering was used in the American colonies was during King William's War. And as I mentioned before, almost every single quote unquote privateer who came from the American colonies during King William's War in the 1690s, the late 1680s, 1690s, was in fact a pirate, and they went into the Indian Ocean. So during the War of the Spanish Succession, there were colonial privateers that actually acted as privateers. There were others that didn't. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, and most importantly, during the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, that's where I think colonial American privateering really came of age, and American privateers were partly credited with the positive outcome for England in the 7 Years' War. They were very effective. They're privateers that came from many ports, and they were successful. And so, ironically, it's because of colonial America's experience with privateering, especially during the 7 Years' War, that come the American Revolution, there were a number of people in the colonies who had great familiarity with privateering, and their tutelage came from England or Britain because they learned it while they were part of the British Empire. So when it came to the American Revolution, there were quite a few people that had either owned privateers, had been captains of privateers, and had served on privateers. So that was part of the reason that in 1775, when the colonies were facing this foe on the ocean, which was their mother country, they almost reflexively turned towards privateering because it was something they all were very familiar with and they knew could be effective, especially for the colonies, which didn't have any navy at the time.
When we think about pirates, our minds often drift to pictures of pirate havens in the Caribbean, places where you had ports in Jamaica, Tortuga, and on some of the other islands where pirates just seemed to hang out. Did privateers have similar hangouts or ports of concentration? Were there some North American port cities where you would tend to find more privateers than others?
Oh, absolutely. The ports in the colonies that were most successful and issued the most letters of marque and had the most privateering were the ones that were best suited to maritime commerce, in effect, and the ones that had the most ships and had the deepest pocketed merchant owners. So we have Boston, Salem, Newburyport, Philadelphia, and New London. Those are also some of the same ports that were most successful prior to the American Revolution. They are where a lot of the merchant shipping came in and out of. That's where a lot of the capital was. That's where a lot of the owners of merchant vessels were. So once war breaks out and privateering becomes a possibility, it's those very owners who are the ones that are going to engage in privateering. And it's those ports that typically have the largest concentration of mariners, many of whom had been put out of work because of the onset of hostilities during the American Revolution. So it was a ready-made pool of workers. So it made sense that the ports that I mentioned and some others, Providence to some extent, became havens for privateering. So it made sense. You're going to go where you have the capital, the resources, and the labor that could sustain privateering. That's where you're going to have the most privateers coming from.
You noted earlier that one of the perks of being a privateer is that there was access to some sort of social relief if you were to be injured on the job. And I wonder if you would tell us more about the allures and dangers of being a privateer and about the type of person who was attracted to this kind of maritime work.
Well, a lot of privateers didn't write their memoirs, and the records aren't that good about each individual privateer that signed on and their ages. But we know that most of the privateers, virtually all of them, are men. I looked very seriously to see if there are any female privateers. And there's one record of maybe one woman being on board a privateering vessel, but the documentation for it is very questionable. I wasn't able to verify it. Just like pirates, there are a few women pirates, but really not many. So most privateersmen were men. Most of them were in their probably early to mid 20s, just like most soldiers were and most mariners at the time. The average age in the colonies at this time is about 16. So we have a younger population anyway. Being on a privateer is rather strenuous. So it's unlikely, unless you're the captain or the first mate, to stretch into your 30s or even early 40s. Then as to what draws people to privateering, this has been a debate in the literature. A lot of people view privateers as just solely being motivated by profits. And I have a very long section of the book where I argue that that's not the case. And if you want to malign privateers for having a profit motive, which was part of their incentive, you'd have to malign almost everybody in the colonies at the time. Because if you look back at the causes of the American Revolution, a lot of it was financially motivated. And on the eve of the American Revolution, American colonists had among the highest per capita income in the Western world. So sort of interesting to knock privateers for wanting to profit when so many Americans, including the Americans who helped foment the beginning of the American Revolution, a lot of the merchants and politicians, money was a major incentive behind all the hostilities before the war actually broke out. And what happened during the war, a lot of it was about not only taxation, but the ability of colonists to make money where and how they wanted to. So I didn't view privateersmen as being very different, if different at all, from their fellow colonists in terms of their motivations. And if you read what they wrote, some of them in memoirs, some of them being reflected in newspaper articles of the time, or other documents that you can read, you see that they were motivated by two different things. One is profit, clearly, but also they were as patriotic as the next person. And the Continental Navy, which was very small at the time, the people that joined the Continental Navy, they also were motivated by profit to a great degree, as well as patriotism. John Paul Jones, who hated privateers, realized that this was the case. And when he was trying to recruit men for the Ranger and other Continental Navy vessels, he always stressed the opportunity to make your fortune. George Washington, probably the number one symbol of Republican virtues and the idea of fighting for your country for patriotic reasons, he himself wrote numerous times that you cannot sustain a war if you don't appeal to people's desire to make money as well as their desire to be patriots and fight for a larger cause. So in a sense, it's very much human nature. So I don't view privateersmen as being any different from their fellow colonists. However, the one thing that's interesting is if you're on a privateering vessel, as opposed to a Continental Navy vessel or in the Army, the regulations are less. There's less of a hierarchy. You have shorter trips. You don't have to sign up for 6 months or a year necessarily. So there was more flexibility, which I think appealed to many people. Also, there were a number of privateers that were successful, and those stories were trumpeted in the local press. So just like people going into a casino hoping to hit it rich, a lot of men joined privateers because they perceived it as a way to enrich themselves. A lot of them weren't enriched. A lot of them didn't make money. A lot of them ended up in prison ships in New York and in prisons in England and died. But that hope, the same for piracy. Most pirates did not get rich, but the 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 examples of pirates that did was enough to nurture everybody else in their hope that they too could strike it rich. And that dynamic played an important role in generating such large numbers of privateers and privateersmen during the American Revolution. And enough privateers were successful that the hope of you being successful could sustain the practice throughout most of the American Revolution. And I just want to add one other thing. I think it's interesting that people belittle privateers and privateersmen for having a profit motive when, if you're a good student of American history in particular, all the way up to the present, the profit motive is so important in almost every single thing that happens in this country. If you want to understand history and you want to understand why it goes in certain directions, if you don't follow the money, you are going to miss a lot of the story. So I find it kind of humorous almost that people want to hold up our founding fathers as being motivated solely by pure Republican ideals when that flies in the face of human nature.
Now, what about the demographics of privateering? When we look at sailors in the British colonial merchant marine, if we think about sailors who shipped goods back and forth, went on fishing boats, whaling boats, the merchant marine tended to be a very diverse cross-section of early American society. On ships, you'd find African Americans, Indigenous Americans, white Americans, and people from Asia, that is, once the United States started trading directly with Asia. Did privateers and privateering represent the same type of diverse cross-section of early American society?
Yes, it absolutely was the same. It was basically a cross-section, but a cross-section largely of the lower echelons of society. Yes, captains of privateering vessels, some first mates, some individuals came from the upper crust or the wealthier or the elites of society, but most of them were drawn from the mariners, the fishermen, landsmen, farmers. But in terms of their profiles, yes, there were quite a few black men who were on privateers. Some were enslaved people who had escaped and wanted their freedom. Others were rented out by the masters, quote unquote, onto these privateers. We don't have complete numbers, but there were many instances of black individuals. Native Americans were on board these privateers vessels. There were people of Scotch descent, Irish descent, English descent, French. I mean, the colonies were a little bit of a melting pot even at this time. And I think the people on the privateers reflected that to a large extent. One of the greatest stories, or one of the most interesting stories in the book that I tell about a black man who's on a privateer, is James Forten, who became much more famous after the American Revolution. But during the American Revolution, when he was in his teens, he lived in Philadelphia, and he was a free black man or teenager, and his mother and father were also free, which was rather unusual. And he was around when the Declaration of Independence was first read in the square on, I think it was July 8th of 1776. And he heard those words, all men are created equal. And he had the temerity to think that his fellow colonists would live up to that creed. And then 4 years later, in 1780, Pennsylvania became the first to pass a partial abolition of slavery law. And those two events helped nurture in him a feeling of patriotism. So when there became an opportunity to join the fight, he chose to join a privateer, the Royal Lewis, heading out of Philadelphia. And he was what was at the time called a monkey boy. He would basically bring ammunition and gunpowder from the magazine to the people manning the cannons. And the Royal Lewis went out and had a very successful first cruise with the captain, Stephen Decatur Sr., not Jr., the one that's more famous, but Stephen Decatur Sr. They captured 7 British merchant ships, brought them back into Philadelphia. James Forten made some money, and he thought this was so great that he signed up for a second cruise. And in hindsight, he would have been better to stay home, because barely a day out of port, the Royal Lewis was captured by the HMS Amphion. And Forten, who was black, thought that he would suffer the same fate as many people of the same complexion did when captured by British ships. And namely, that was to be brought to the Caribbean and sold in a slave mart. But fortunately for him, the captain of the Amphion, a guy named John Baisley, had a 12-year-old son on board who needed a companion. And he tapped Forten to be his companion, his son's companion. So for a number of weeks, they got along famously. So when the HMS Amphion pulled into New York Harbor, where there were these prison hulks or prison ships, Baisley gave Forten a choice. He said, you can either go to England as a ward of my son. You'll be free. You'll have money. You'll get an education. Or you're going to be disembarked here with the other mariners from the Royal Lewis, and you're going to be put in a prison ship. And James Forten decided to stay with his colleagues, so to speak, and he actually was put on the Jersey prison ship. And amazingly enough, he lasted for 8 months and then got out on a prisoner exchange. Many privateers were not as lucky, and many thousands died on these prison ships. That's a fascinating story during the Revolution, but to me, it even becomes more interesting after the American Revolution. James Forten still believed that his new country should live up to the creed or the rousing words in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. And he fought most of his life to help make the United States a more free and welcoming place for people of his complexion. And one of the things that he did is he helped give William Lloyd Garrison seed money for his newspaper, The Liberator. And when James Forten died in the early 1840s, he was a wealthy man. He had become one of the main sailmakers in Philadelphia, and he supposedly died with an estate worth more than $70,000. So I just love that story. It's just a fascinating story of a privateersman during the American Revolution, but also somebody that played a larger role in American history.
Now, as Eric has been telling us, his book Rebels at Sea focuses on the history and use of privateers by the Continental Congress during the American War for Independence. Eric, we need to take a moment for our episode sponsor. When we return, we'd love for you to tell us more about how privateers fit within the American Revolutionaries' wartime strategy. Are you ready to commemorate Juneteenth? Consider coming to Colonial Williamsburg for a new event. To commemorate the triumphant spirit of the African American journey, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation will host a Juneteenth sunrise service on Sunday, June 18 at 6 a.m. The service will take place at the majestic Compton Oak on Market Square, as the Compton Oak is a landmark tree that symbolizes life, endurance, shelter, and joy. The ceremony will also include a special keynote address by visionary thought leader Tina Lifford. For more information about Juneteenth and commemorating the holiday here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Juneteenth. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Juneteenth. Eric, would you tell us more about how privateers fit into the American Revolutionaries' wartime strategy? Why did the Continental Congress engage privateers when it had the Continental Navy?
When the American Revolution began, we didn't have any Navy, and Massachusetts actually was the first colony to launch privateering in November of 1775, specifically because they wanted to create some kind of force that could extend power on the ocean, and there was no Navy to rely on. Actually, George Washington had his quote-unquote secret Navy, which the Continental Congress didn't know much about for a while, where he used Army men and mariners and General John Glover and his Marblehead men to man ships specifically to go out and attack transport ships from England that were carrying ammunition and other goods that the newborn Continental Army could use to successfully repulse the British. So there was a lot of interest going to sea and trying to project power on the sea and cause problems at the same time for the British. The Continental Navy began on October 13th, 1775, but it had a really difficult time ramping up. Keep in mind, the Continental Congress didn't have the ability to levy taxes. They were cash-strapped throughout the American Revolution, and starting a navy from scratch is administratively very difficult and financially very onerous. And the Continental Navy only came to life in fits and starts, and its record was really not that good throughout the course of the American Revolution. There are only ultimately about 60 or so Continental Navy vessels. So privateering helped fill a breach or a void. If the Continental Congress could have developed a very, very strong Navy, maybe privateering wouldn't have come about. But keep in mind, even the Continental Congress never thought that its Navy would go toe-to-toe with British warships. They were just totally outclassed. The Continental Navy was supposed to attack British warships when it could, but also attack British merchant ships, just like privateers. So it was in the context of what was possible during the American Revolution that privateering played an important role. It filled a void that the Continental Navy could not fill. And almost overnight, we had nearly 2,000 privateers going out and helping America win its fight and causing pain to the British. There are a number of ways that privateering helped. They captured almost 1,800 British ships. That caused a lot of pain. Privateering in the Caribbean decreased trade between England and its sugar colonies, which was the most important external source of funding for the British Empire at that time. During the first few years of the American Revolution, trade plummeted 66% between England and its Caribbean colonies. So there was a lot of pain inflicted. It helped lead to a weariness on the part, especially of British merchants, over the continuance of this war. It also played a role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, because the French were very partial to American privateering. And even though there were treaties between France and England that said neither could entertain privateers of other countries and assist them in any way, especially enemy countries, France went out of its way to enable American privateers to use French ports in the Caribbean, such as Martinique, and French ports like Dunkirk on the continent to get supplies, sell goods, even bring on board French mariners to fill out their crews. And this made England furious. And at one point, England thought it was going to go to war with France before they came into the war on account of its privateering support for the Americans. So it was a major irritant and helped create the environment in which, after the Battle of Saratoga, that the French were able to more easily come into the war on the side of the Americans. Another very important thing that I think is often overlooked that privateers did is they gainfully employed many mariners who had been put out of work. Just think about it. The cities and towns that were most influential during the American Revolution, had the most political power, were places like Boston, New London, and Philadelphia. And if it weren't for privateering and then being able to put their capital to work, so to speak, and for all the men who were on privateers to work, just think there might have been a lot more unrest in those cities and towns, and the support for the American Revolution might have not been quite as strong as it was. But another thing is that all these British ships, mainly merchant ships that were captured and brought back into the colonies, they had a lot of cargo on board. And that cargo was sold at public auctions, and it made its way into the American economy at a time when there were a lot of privations. There was some ammunition brought in, there were cannons brought in. Also, the ships were sold. And a lot of the ships, the British merchant ships that were captured by privateers, brought into port and sold, turned around and became American privateers and went out and continued to create problems for the British. So the key thing to keep in mind is that the American Revolution, as George Washington said, was winning it was like a standing miracle. And it was because there were so many different elements that had to go just right, so many different pieces that contributed to the ultimate success. Not just George Washington being a leader, but 100 other things had to happen. And I argue that one of those, and one of the most important things, is privateering. But it was part of an overall tableau of effectiveness on the part of the American colonies in fighting England. And I can't tell you, if we didn't have privateers, that we wouldn't have won the American Revolution, because no historian is going to be able to tell you without X, history would have gone in this direction. But I would argue very strongly that privateering was an important part of the overall puzzle. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were no privateers, that things might have ended up differently.
Eric, you've painted us a pretty rosy picture of privateering in the American Revolution. You told us how privateers served as an economic driver, both in employing maritime people who needed jobs during the war, as well as in bringing important cargoes from captured ships into American ports. And then you just told us how important privateering was to the Americans' war effort, and that privateers go out, they capture ships, and this capturing really puts an economic damper on England's ability to trade with its Caribbean colonies. And when it's putting a damper on that trade, that really limited England's ability to seek its own economic development and fortune. So there seemed to be a lot of upsides here to the revolutionaries using privateers during the American Revolution. So were there any downsides of the Americans using privateers during the war effort?
Well, there are a lot of downsides. I mean, one of which got the Continental Congress very upset is that privateers siphoned men away from the Continental Navy. They also siphoned men away from the Continental Army. With respect to the Continental Navy, if you read the book, you'll see that their record was not that good. And I don't think it was because they didn't have enough men. There were other institutional constraints that led to the Continental Navy not being incredibly successful. But there's no doubt that privateers was a drain on manpower. So that's one negative. Another negative is not so much a negative for the rest of the colonies, but I don't want to paint such a rosy picture, because the Jersey alone, the prison ship in New York, many privateers got captured and many privateers were killed in battle. And when American ships were captured, whether or not they were privateers, the prisoners were often sent either back to England to be at Mill and Fortin prison, or more likely they were sent to the prison ships in the colonies, most of which were in New York, but there were also ones down in South Carolina and one up in Halifax. But the ones in New York are particularly noteworthy, especially the Jersey. And although records aren't complete, the most extensive studies have shown that perhaps as many as 11,500 Americans died on these prison ships, which were old British warships that were dismasted and basically moored in Wallabout Bay or New York Harbor. And the Jersey, which was a large ship, but still had anywhere between 850 and 1,200 prisoners below decks at any one time. 6 to 12 men died a day from disease, starvation. It was just a miserable existence. And of those 11,500 people that died on the Jersey during the duration of the war, and the Jersey was only in operation for a few years, not the entire war, of those 11,500 people, the vast majority of them were privateersmen. It was a very dangerous occupation to go into. And the people who were signing on to the privateers knew that. And that's yet another argument that there must have been something a little bit more important than just profit to draw them onto these ships, where they knew for a fact that a significant percentage of the people who set foot on a privateer and went forth to fight the British or capture British ships, a significant percentage of them ended up dead. So I just don't think that profit alone would sustain such individual decisions.
A lot of what we've been talking about with privateers and what made privateering so dangerous was the ability of these mariners to go out into the ocean, see a British ship, and capture it, or at least attempt to capture it. And we wonder what this process looked like. Eric, if we're picturing this process of one ship capturing another in our minds, what should we be picturing? What went into the captain's decision to head after a ship, and what did the process of actually pursuing and capturing a ship look like?
Yeah, think about pirates again, since so many people think about pirates and privateering in the same breath. When a pirate is out on the open ocean, it has to determine what the ship is or whether it can take over the ship or whether it wants to get into a fight. With privateers, it was a little more complicated. First, they were technically only supposed to take British ships or other ships that were bringing British munitions, ammunition, and supplies to the Royal Navy or the British forces in North America. They would go to places where it was most likely there would be potential ships to capture. And those are the normal trade routes or sailing routes between England and the colonies. Also, a number of privateers went to the African coast, where they knew there were a lot of British slave traders, and there were a lot of British vessels that were captured by American privateers. So first they would go to where there was potential prey. But once they saw a ship, if they're far off, a couple of miles off, or maybe even closer, they can get a sense of what kind of ship they're coming up against. If a privateer saw that it was a 64-gun ship of the line, they are not going to mess with them. They're going to try to escape. And there were some cases in which British warships captured American privateers that were trying to flee. But if the ship was of a similar size or appeared to be a merchant ship that wasn't particularly well defended, it didn't have a lot of cannon ports or cannons that were visible, or maybe not a lot of people on the main deck, then the privateer captain would have to decide if he wanted to go in closer to investigate. And you would go in closer and you try to get as many clues as you can. If the vessel had the Union Jack flying on the top of its mast, that was pretty good evidence that it might have been a British ship. But when they got closer, they often would bring out their speaking trumpet and they'd call across the water unless a fight broke out. And they try to figure out who this person was, ask them who they are, gauge the response, and then oftentimes ask them to send over their boat with a few people with information about the vessel, its manifest, or other information that would prove who they are. If it was a British ship and they didn't want to fight and they surrendered, which happened most of the time, then the privateer would have captured a ship. However, there were a number of times when fighting broke out because a lot of British merchant ships were heavily armed. And they had been even prior to the American Revolution. And a lot of American merchant ships, when they went out prior to the American Revolution, had some cannons on board, swivel guns, muskets, cutlasses, because of pirates and the potential need to protect themselves. So the ideal scenario was to come upon a ship, determine that it was British, ask them to surrender, and they surrendered because they were outgunned. And most merchant ships, even if they had a few cannons, maybe they only had 20 or 30 people on board, whereas a privateer that was opposing them might be of a similar size, might have 16 cannons and 100 people on board. So the British would realize it wasn't going to be a fair fight and they would surrender instead of risk their lives. However, a number of British merchant ships fought valiantly and sometimes won. And there are many accounts of 10, 15, 20 people on both sides being killed during these firefights. And whoever won the firefight would be able to claim the other ship as a prize, unless it was so destroyed during the fight that they both sort of sailed away from each other as best they could, realizing that they just wanted to avoid sinking and get back to their port. So it was a fraught experience to determine whether or not there was a potential prize in front of you.
We've discussed how part of the Continental Congress's strategy for employing privateers, one of their reasons to employ privateers, was the fact that the United States just didn't have a big, well-armed continental navy. But if you look at the British Navy, well, that's an entirely different story. On paper, the British really don't seem to need privateers because they have the world's biggest and most successful navy during the 1770s. Now, Chris wonders what this professional British Navy made of the Americans' use of privateers in their fight for independence. And he also wonders whether the British or any other European powers involved in this war also employed privateers. So, despite how it looked on paper, did the British Navy also hire privateers?
The British hated American privateers. They viewed them as pirates, and they often wrote about them in that manner, which is kind of interesting because during the American Revolution, the British themselves sent out thousands of privateers, not only to fight against the American colonists, but also to fight against France and the Dutch and the Spanish after the war evolved into this world war once France and Spain got involved. So it's kind of rich that the British viewed American privateering in such a negative light, whereas the British themselves had honed the practice of privateering over many centuries and did use it extensively during the American Revolution. And American loyalists in New York, in particular, sent out more than 150 New York Tory privateers during the American Revolution. And you may wonder, as part of that question implies that Britain was this very powerful naval force. That's absolutely true. At the outset of the American Revolution, they had about 270 significant British warships, but many of them were in disrepair. I mean, part of the reason that all those taxes were slapped on the Americans in the 1760s and early 1770s is because after the French and Indian War, British economy was suffering a little bit, and they'd spent a lot to beat France, and their navy had suffered a lot, and they hadn't really invested in it as much as they should have. So at the outset of the American Revolution, the British Navy looked great on paper, but in practice, it was a little more tattered. During the American Revolution, it came around. I mean, they expanded phenomenally during the American Revolution, the British Navy. But even with that, they couldn't do everything on the open ocean, especially after France came into the fight. So a lot of naval ships had to be engaged in fighting other countries' naval ships and protecting key resources. So British privateers, like American privateers, filled a little bit of a void. They weren't nearly as successful as American privateers, but they did capture many hundreds of American ships. So the American Revolution on the ocean was a fight between a miniature continental navy, a huge British navy, but it was also a fight between a very significant American privateering force and a significant British privateering force. So being on the ocean during the American Revolution was a scary place to be. There were a lot of people armed and looking for a fight.
So Eric, when you think about all of your research and you think about the contributions that privateers made to the American Revolution and to the war for American independence, what do you think their most important contributions were to this war effort?
I would say that it was really probably bringing goods and ships and cannons and gunpowder, ammunition, all sorts of supplies into the colonies as a result of prizes being brought in. It's hard to quantify that because the records are very dispersed and not always well maintained, but just reading newspaper accounts at the time, one guy that wrote into a Philadelphia newspaper in, I think, 1779 or 1780 basically said without the supplies and goods that have been brought in by our privateers, we couldn't have survived. So I think that was very important and is not often thought about. I also happen to think the irritation between France and Britain that was engendered by France's assistance to American privateering was very important. Of course, without the successful Battle of Saratoga, France probably wouldn't have come into the war. But there was a point before that where British accounts clearly state that we are on the edge of war with France over this privateering issue. So who knows? I think those are two of the most important things. I also think another thing I mentioned before, the fact that a lot of otherwise unemployed mariners were given some kind of employment, and some of them came back with some money that helped their families and helped their local communities. I think that was also important. And the psychological benefit of having successful privateering raids and captures, because the 30 or so newspapers that were being published in the American colonies at the time did have a number of articles on privateering success. And much of the American Revolution was filled with bad news for the Americans, defeats on land and fighting another day. So bright spots were sometimes provided by privateering successes.
And now we should tackle the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. So, Eric, this may be a tale of be careful what you wish for, because you did mention this earlier in the episode, but in your opinion, what might have happened if the Continental Congress had banned the use of privateers during the American War for Independence? How might the quest for American independence have turned out differently without the use of privateers?
If there was no privateering, I think that the American Revolution certainly would have gone in a different direction. Whether or not the Americans would have ultimately won, I think it's quite doubtful. I believe that there were enough positives coming from privateering that without that piece of the puzzle, we might not have had enough to sustain ourselves, and we might not have caused enough pain to the British for them to decide, okay, let's get out of this war however we can. If France hadn't come into the war at a certain time, I don't know. It's very hard to answer that, because what would have happened if there's no privateering? Other things would have happened that perhaps didn't happen. Maybe the Continental Navy would have expanded to a greater degree. I find that hard to believe given how cash-strapped the Continental Congress was, but maybe it would have happened. Maybe without privateers causing problems for British shipping and forcing a number of British warships to do convoy duty and to try to seek out and destroy American privateers, the Royal Navy might have been able to focus more of its force just on the American colonies and perhaps placing embargoes of some sort or lines in the ocean around key American ports and starving the Americans to death. So that may have been one result, without privateers to siphon off some of the manpower from the British and some of their vessels. Maybe the Royal Navy would have been more effective in its attempts to bring the Americans to heel. I don't know. There are a lot of ways to think about it. I'm not going to say that it definitely would have changed the outcome of the war.
Now that Rebels at Sea is out into the world, what kind of swashbuckling maritime history are you researching and writing about now?
Just finishing up a book. It's basically a story about 5 men, 3 British, 2 Americans, who were intentionally left on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. And it's really a fascinating story about people who weren't important in the long range of history. None of them were particularly noteworthy or famous during their time or afterwards, but they were brought together. There were 2 ships. There was a shipwreck. There was Americans. There were British. There was a British warship. It ended up these 5 men spent 18 months on the Falkland Islands alone. to me, it was just a fascinating story about early maritime America and the risks that attended sailing on the open ocean. And anyway, that's the story that I'm working on, and I'm just finishing up.
And what's the best place for us to get in touch with you if we have more questions about privateers or life on the Atlantic Ocean during the 18th century? Do you have a website we can visit?
My name, Eric J. Dolin, EricJaydolin.com. And it's a really good place to go if you're at all interested in any of my books, because for each one of my books, I have the introduction to the book on the website. So you can read the introduction to Rebels at Sea, and there's also reviews and other stuff related to the books. And I also have an events page. I give a number of talks on my books. So that's a good place to find out if I'm going to be in your area.
Eric J. Dolin, thank you for helping us better understand privateering and the role that privateers and privateering played in the American Revolution.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
When we think about the military aspects of the American Revolution, we most often think about General George Washington and his Continental Army. We think about land battles. But the military conflict of the American Revolution was also waged on water. In addition to important land battles and sieges such as Saratoga and Yorktown, there were also important naval battles, such as the Battle of Valcour Island and the Battle of the Capes. And in between those naval battles, American privateers and privateersmen plied the waters of the Atlantic Ocean and did their part to capture British naval and trading ships to disrupt the military supply chain and economy Great Britain needed to win its overseas war effort. As Eric revealed, the Americans' naval strategy did not involve going toe-to-toe with massive British warships with well-trained crews. Instead, it relied on using continental naval vessels and privateers to harry the British by intercepting needed wartime supplies and disrupting trade between Great Britain and her cash crop-producing Caribbean colonies that supplied much-needed funds to Great Britain's economy. Now, disrupting trade not only made it harder for British forces to receive the materiel they needed to wage the war, it also dampened Britain's wartime attitudes and support for the war. As Eric noted, British merchants really didn't like losing cargoes to privateer capture or being unable to trade during the war. So in addition to the contributions of bringing in much-needed wartime supplies and goods to the United States during the war, we might also consider privateers' impact on the economy and wartime attitudes in Great Britain as another contribution privateers made toward winning the United States' independence. Look for more information about Eric, his book, Rebels at Sea, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/357. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so please tell your friends about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Joseph Edelman, Holly White, Ian Tonat, and Taylor Fisher. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, you seem to love episodes about maritime history, so what other topics would you like to investigate in an episode? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.